Hey everyone, welcome to the 12th installment of the Inside JABA Series of the Behavioral Observations podcast. I am going to start these opening remarks with a quick reference to the ethics code for behavior analysts, and I'm going to reference code element 1.07 specifically, and it goes as follows. I'm going to paraphrase here. Behavior analysts actively engage in professional development activities to acquire knowledge and skills related to cultural responsiveness and diversity, and that they evaluate their own biases and ability to address the needs of individuals with diverse needs and backgrounds. And in order to provide some direction in this effort, the guests for today's episode, Drs. Corina Jimenez-Gomez and Lauren Beaulieu, have written a pair of well-researched and thoughtful papers that have been published in the spring and summer issues of JABA. And these papers are as follows: Cultural Responsiveness in Applied Behavior Analysis, Self-Assessment, and Cultural Responsiveness in Applied Behavior Analysis, Research and Practice. I have links to both of those papers in the show notes for this episode, as well as for many of the other references that we discussed today. And the interested reader would do well to actually look up those specific articles and actually just go through the reference lists of them. It represents a treasure trove of additional reading in this area. So with regard to this episode itself, Corina and Lauren were kind enough to join Dr. Jeff Tiger and me to discuss their scholarship in this area. And particularly, we talked about how Lauren and Corina became interested in this topic. We review some basic terms as well as some misconceptions in this area. We talk about the importance of self-assessment. We talk about what it's like to immerse yourself in unfamiliar literatures. Talk about the role of culturally responsive functional assessment practices. We talk about Western science as a culture, mistakes we sometimes make as practitioners, social validity, and much, much more. This episode will be available for 1.5 ethics CEUs. You can learn more about how to access those over at behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs. And I would also humbly suggest that you consider subscribing to JABA as well if you want to support the mission of this type of work. And you can learn how to do that. I've got links over at the show notes as well. So for interested readers, again, you can just go to behavioralobservations.com and look for Inside JABA 12, and we'll have a lot of additional reading and resources there waiting for you. So we've got a pretty lengthy episode here, so I'm going to keep these opening remarks as brief as possible. So without any further delay, please enjoy this fun conversation with Jeff, Lauren, and Corina.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now, here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Inside JABA Series number 12. We just had a little conversation trying to figure out whether or not we were at 12 or 11 or 13, but we're pretty sure this is Inside JABA number 12. I can't believe we've done 12 of these thus far. It's been a fun project I've been proud to be a part of. I am joined today by Inside JABA regular, Dr. Jeff Tiger, and we're also joined by a couple of special guests here, Drs. Corina Jimenez-Gomez and Dr. Lauren Beaulieu. And we're talking about a pair of papers that they've written recently in the last two issues of the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. I have the names of the papers right here. There is the first one is Cultural Responsiveness in Applied Behavior Analysis, Self-Assessment. That's by Beaulieu and Jimenez-Gomez. And then Cultural Responsiveness in Applied Behavior Analysis, Research and Practice. And that's Jimenez-Gomez, Beaulieu. So welcome everyone to this very special episode of the Inside JABA series.
Thank you very much, Matt, as always, for allowing us to speak of the good work that is going on in JABA, and we're very excited to get the chance to highlight these particular contributions. And thank you so much, Lauren and Corina, both for being with us today.
Yeah, and as usual in these Inside JABA series, I'm going to we're without our leader today. That'd be Dr. Linda LeBlanc, and so we're so Jeff, you're gonna do the heavy lifting here with some of the Q&A. So I'm gonna be relying on you to start us off here. So if you could maybe, I suppose I'll just hand over the microphone metaphorically to you, the Zoom square, and you can get us underway here.
Welcome to both of you. And I was hoping you could start out by telling us a little of your stories of, kind of your personal histories that brought you to behavior analysis, and what brought you to, this important topic. How did you guys come together to collaborate on these studies?
Well, thank you for the invitation. This is, we're very happy to be here. So I trained as an undergrad in psychology in Venezuela, which is where I'm originally from. And the focus was in clinical psychology. And I was drawn to working with people who were teaching in what appeared to be kind of more scientific courses, experimental psych and that sort of thing. And I started working in an operant and classical conditioning lab, and that's sort of how I got into behavior analysis. But a lot of the clinical work that I was doing was working with diverse populations in a range of different settings. I went to a Catholic university, so there was a big focus on doing outreach work. So I trained in experimental analysis of behavior, then in behavioral pharmacology, but I was always interested in kind of like the socially relevant issues, And then I guess my personal life, I became a mom. I was living in New Zealand, and I started to get interested in other things that weren't necessarily working in a pigeon lab. And that led me to work with kids and kids with autism and developmental disabilities. And then I guess my own personal commitment to issues of diversity and anti-racism just started to kind of come out more and more. And I think just because of my personal identities, being an immigrant, I'm a non-native English speaker, I'm a woman in science, living in the current day and age, So I went from thinking that to be professional, I had to kind of closet a lot of things and just present myself as the behavior analyst. And then I kind of started to realize that didn't need to be. And I guess more recently in 2020, I was revamping a course that I was teaching, and there was, the summer of 2020 was going on. There's just like all these things. And I really realized that I wanted to change how I was doing some of my mentorship and teaching. And Lauren and I had overlapped at Florida Tech very briefly. And I knew that she was interested in these things. So I just sent her a message online, and I was like, hey, I know you're interested in these things. You've published in this area. This is something I'm interested in. Would you like to collaborate? And then she responded very quickly, and she was like, well, actually, I'm starting a project on this, and this is very, great interest to me. So it was like, I looked it up last night, and it was like June of 2020. And since then, Lauren and I have just been Zooming and calling and emailing and working and reading and growing and learning from each other.
Yeah, and I think I kind of fell into behavior analysis like a lot of people, where you don't actually know it's a career, as you're kind of growing up. But I was interested in psychology, and my advisor actually told me that I was at Florida State at the time, and said that if you really want to go into graduate school in psychology, you have to start doing research. And so I signed up on this sheet in the FSU psychology department and kind of waited for a call back. And May Barker actually called me. She was one of John Bailey's students, and she started describing her study. And I'll just be completely honest, it did not sound that exciting to 21-year-old me. It was a shopping cart safety study. So I would spend the summer kind of hanging out in the shopping, in a grocery store, taking data on whether or not people were buckling up their kids. And I decided to do it, even though, again, that wasn't really the type of psychology, at least at the moment, I thought I was interested in. And it was actually the coolest experience, because there was, in baseline, we saw really little people buckling up their kids. And then she did this really simple little intervention, having a greeter just say something, and the buckling went up to really high levels. And I thought, wow, that's such a little intervention that can have such a powerful impact on behavior. So that really got me interested in behavior analysis. And then she asked if I wanted to work in the public school system and helping kids diagnosed with autism at the time. And that's kind of how I got started. And I've spent kind of half of my career in practice and half of my career in academia. And I I've just kind of recently been back to practice, and it's a very eye-opening experience coming from academia. So, with respect to cultural competence and cultural responsiveness, I kind of fell into that area as well. I was a new program director at Regis College. They had a brand new ABA program, Master's in ABA program, and I was developing the coursework. And I was attending these faculty meetings, and they were talking about the nursing faculty. We're talking about these culturally competent nurses that they were developing. And that really struck me because I'm like, what does that mean? Like, what is a culturally competent nurse? So I started asking them questions about it. And the more I talked to them, I was just like, this is so relevant to what we do. Why haven't I heard about this? And so I went to the literature looking for culturally competent behavior analysts. And again, this was back in 2012, but I didn't find anything. And so then I started looking in other fields. Like I went to medicine since I was learning about this from nursing faculty. And then I slowly kind of stumbled around into other fields and realized that basically everybody's talking about it but us. And then Fong and Tanaka published this great paper back in 2013 that was the standards for cultural competence. And I was like, wow, okay, it's coming to our field. But it was kind of slow going at first. And so that's kind of what led me into this area. I mean, I'm interested in behavior and I'm interested in helping people. And now I'm hoping that we can try to help people see that you can't really be an effective practitioner and you can't really understand behavior unless you understand the impacts of culture too. So it should be all of our area of interest.
Absolutely. So Linda left a note for me. Is the very first or second, I think, Inside JABA podcast we did came out right as she wrote her paper about trying to solicit folks to contribute big ideas. And then this is your guys' second big idea paper. So just on behalf of Linda, thank you so much that this is exactly what you had in mind. And, for myself, we've always tried to incorporate, culture responsive practice and serving diverse populations and serving diverse groups of students to ultimately become behavior analysts. And the recognized need for that, as you kind of mentioned in the summer of 2020, just became so much more apparent of how much more was needed if it wasn't already, should have been as obvious as it was. And I looked to your guys' work at that point. I reached out to Lauren. She and I have known each other for a couple of years. And I was so grateful we wanted to make sure we weren't just doing something, but doing something well. And to have you both as resources, I'm so grateful for. And on behalf of a grateful field, thank you for the work that you're doing and helping educate us. So to kind of hop in and start getting into the meat of the paper a little bit, or these papers. So one of the things that really jumped out to me right away was your discussion of the notion of cultures and that kind of the plain word association. When I first think of the word culture, I'm usually thinking of culture on a very macro level, culture as it relates to race and nationality. But you really introduced kind of the notion of culture on a much more micro level. So the culture of your workplace or the culture of your individual family. And it you even talked about the culture of as a behavior analyst, the research groups or the advisors that you were trained with, and how that influences your selection of assessment techniques. So we're supposed to be database science, but we all have these kind of perceived cultural biases. And I don't know. I feel like all of a sudden, what was the Chris Farley Saturday Night Live skit? Hey, do you remember when? That was great. So that's kind of how I feel at the moment. But it so resonated with me as we talk about culture on such a micro level, whether it's the culture of behavior analysis as a field or the culture of our programs.
I just want to jump in here and just for folks following along, that's the Chris Farley show. That was the skit, and that was I'll put a YouTube link to in the show notes for anyone who is interested in checking that out, which I highly recommend. And the Chris Farley show actually was the inspiration for this podcast, which I'll leave people to watch the video to understand how those things relate. So anyway.
So I offline before we started, we had a discussion of the iterative process of trying to become more culturally responsive. And I was hoping maybe you could talk about some of your own, professional experiences, whether in academia or practice of, either the things that you've seen of somebody, examples of like how projecting your own cultural biases, onto others can have negative impacts, or places where you've adopted or evolved over time in your own practice?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think that it really helps kind of bring to light how this is relevant to all of us too, kind of highlighting how kind of our journey through it. And before I talk about some missteps I've made, I also want to make the point too that, and I can't speak on behalf of Corina, but I'm definitely not an expert in this area. And I think that a lot of times when you're invited to do a podcast or you're invited to do a presentation, people just kind of assume that you're an expert because you're up there talking. But the reason that I got into reading and doing this training and working with Corina and writing these papers was really because I found a significant deficit in my training and my background and my education. And so this was a process to try to help bring me along to understand how to deliver those culturally responsive practices. And so I just want to make it clear too that like I don't see myself as an expert. So I would love to talk about too is how I've kind of grown, because I have noticed that I'm definitely different from when I started this process. And I'm sure in 10 more years, I'm going to be even more different, because it is this lifelong process. You're not going to, there's never this level of mastery that once you get it, you get the certificate and now you're a culturally responsive practitioner. It's something that you have to kind of constantly work towards. But when I first started, so I was developing the master's program and I was like, okay, how do I do this? Like, how do I develop culturally competent behavior analysts? And at the time, that's the term I was using because that was the term that was introduced to me. And I couldn't find anything in our field. And I kept reading in medicine. They're like, and intersperse it through the coursework. It should be in every course. And that's best practice. But I'm like, but how? How do we do this? And so I just started with a step and I said, okay, well, I'll create a project. It was in an autism spectrum disorder course. It was a course that all the students had to take. And I made them have to work together because I thought, okay, if I make them work together, that also adds in a level of complexity because now they have to learn to negotiate with each other. They had to pick a culture and then I had some guided questions where they had to go and explore that culture and the impact of autism and how, autism was looked at and so forth. And so looking back, that's not the way we really want to teach culturally responsive practice. It's not, you don't just create a project in a course. It really does have to be interspersed and embedded throughout the entire curriculum. And now I feel like I'm better at knowing how to do that. But again, it takes time and everybody's going to start small. And so even if you start small and you just start with that project and then you start learning more and more and how you can embed it in, then over time you'll make more strides. So that's kind of how I misstepped in academia, was just doing the project and then not really knowing what to do. With respect to practice, I think that my biggest misstep has been, before learning about this, I had a really hard time understanding, understanding that I was a cultural being, that I belonged to a culture. I kind of looked at myself as kind of absent culture, and that everybody who was different from me was diverse, and that and I think that from what I've read, the more I've read, is that this is a very common belief of people living in the U.S. who are white. And that's just kind of how our culture and our community shapes us to be. And unless we make active strides, then we can start kind of thinking a little bit differently. But because of that, because I had that idea, I was kind of comparing my values, my ideals as being, that's kind of the norm. And then if everybody else does something that's different, but my norm is what we should be striving for. Now, that's not a good way to think, right? Because it's not accepting of diverse cultures. It's projecting my culture on somebody else and almost forcing them to assimilate to my culture. And so the more I've learned about cultural responsiveness is how I need to take a step back and really collaborate with the people that I'm working with. Now I'm in practice. So really listening to the teachers, really listening to the parents about the goals that are important for the clients that I have. And if I think that something else is more important, then I start to interrogate myself. Why? Why do I think that's more important? Is it because I'm placing a huge value on independence? This parent may not have that huge value on independence. So that may be why they're not really that really enthused about that particular goal. That may be why that they want to do work on this goal. And so I think that with respect to my practice, that's the biggest change, has been my ability to kind of see from another perspective, using that posture of cultural humility, and recognizing that everybody's there's not just one right way. There's a lot of different right ways, and we have to learn to kind of collaborate with other people.
Everything that Lauren said, that's what I'm thinking. You brought up several interesting points. I think that the first caveat is important. The work that we've put out we've benefited greatly from the scholarship of Black and Brown individuals in other fields who have done a lot of this work. We're borrowing a lot of terminology and a lot of their ideas. And what we've done is bring it together and sort of translate it for behavior analysts to consume. And how does this fit into the framework of behavior analysis? Because I think oftentimes we are hesitant to read things that are outside of our field in journals that are not behavior analytic, particularly if the words that are being used sound not behavioral. So we're trained that way. Again, part of the culture, what you were saying before, Jeff, right? Like the behavior analytic culture, shirking away from particular words. And if that's the barrier, then we are knocking it down. So that's no longer a barrier. Here we're talking about behavioral processes that underlie behaving in this way. So that's sort of the impetus for this, I think. But definitely recognizing the fact that the ideas are not new. We're not coming up with these things. And we've benefited greatly from this previous work that we cite throughout. And our reference list is ginormous because of it. And like Lauren said, we're learning every day. And I think that I am a much better human today because of my interactions with Lauren for 2 years. I also am part of an accountability group. So I did the Academics for Black Lives workshop in 2020. They offered it twice. I did it both times. And then a group of behavior analysts that were part of that, we meet every single week and we talk, and we've been doing this for 2 years. And those conversations with colleagues, with people who know your jargon, and with whom you can have conversations about these sort of issues and check in and say, this is what I'm thinking. Does this make sense? Or this is a struggle I'm facing in academia, practice, whatever, has been so valuable. And I think that that's sort of that continued growth. And it speaks to the first paper of ours, the self-assessment piece of just being able to recognize aspects of our own learning history that shape the way we view the world, the way we react to particular stimuli in the environment. The fact that Lauren can say, wait a minute, is this my value or is this the family's value? And there's an example from my own work that I think I always think of it when somebody asks me, like, tell me a time you stepped in, and I was like, oh, I got the perfect example. So I being an immigrant and being, I think I kind of the flip side of Lauren. So Lauren said that she thought of herself as somebody without culture. I thought that, I knew a lot about it because I can see myself being different from the dominant group. And I thought that made it easier, but it also precluded me from looking at the subtleties of the subgroups. So I had a family who were my clients, and they were from Venezuela. So the minute I hear that they're from Venezuela and I hear them speaking, I was like, yes, I know these people so well. It was nice to meet you, and I know you very well, which is, kind of ridiculous in hindsight. But my values on developing independent skills for children, for instance, is high. And I assumed I'm a parent. That person's a parent. We share a nationality. Therefore, like my equivalence class was, snapped in, and I was terribly wrong. And instead of taking that step back, I immediately jumped in to assume something. And it's the flip side of what Lauren was saying of not being able to see the culture. Here, I thought I was seeing it without really seeing it. So I think it highlights the importance of constantly revising and knowing that the individual in front of you is the individual in front of you. They're not just a member of a group. They're a member of a group, but also a member of many groups. And it's that intersectionality of identities that, yes, they were from Venezuela, but there were also a lot of other things that made them actually pretty different than me. So it was very humbling. Luckily, I realized all this fairly quickly. And it was a good experience for me. And it was also a good moment for me to highlight this to my students and say, look, I jumped to a conclusion here, and I wanted to focus on this child learning how to feed himself. And the parent doesn't care about that. And this is why I did it. This is why it wasn't the right move. And this is what I should have done. And, so it was a learning experience. And I think that it humbled me greatly. And that's why I remember it very clearly. And it also served as an opportunity for me to practice what I preach of, own up to it and call yourself in and use it as a learning opportunity. Because I could have, pretended like it didn't happen or not told my students or something, but and now the world will know because Matt Sikoria is recording it.
Well, I'm so grateful to both of you for being able to share those experiences. I feel like so often it's, kind of the fear of making a mistake. Like, I just don't want to say the wrong thing. That being able to hear others say, no, I did this, I learned from it, I'm better from it, is so helpful for those trying to take the first step. I know that's always a kind of my internal clock is like, oh, careful on this one. But that anxiety can often hold you back from being able to be effective. So circling back, Lauren, you kind of described your history and concerns with the use of the term cultural competence in describing what you're trying to achieve. And throughout, I guess, paper 2 in the series, introduce some additional terminology as it relates to cultural recognition or culturally trying to come up with a good broad term for it, but culturally responsive practice. So would you mind talking us through the discrimination that you're making there, some of the challenges with the notion of cultural competence and how we do better?
Yes. Yeah. And actually, I think that it's also a good example of confirmation bias on my own part too, because it was first, as I mentioned, I learned about it because of that term, culturally competent nurses. And so the people that I was, my little community there at Regis College, they're talking about cultural competence. I'm going to the literature looking at cultural competence when I first started learning about this. And I would get this kind of like smattering of critiques saying that cultural competence was bad, but I would just disregard them. Oh, that's like the fringe, And so again, looking back on it is such a fascinating kind of exercise to see how, like, the confirmation bias in action. I would push those ones away because they weren't confirming my idea of what I thought cultural competence was based on what I was told it was. And so I was attending to the articles that were matching what I was taught cultural competence was. It was like this lifelong endeavor, that it's about acquiring skills, it's about cultural humility. And so if it didn't have that, I would just, it's the fringe, you guys, there's thousands of papers, just so you know, so you can't read them all. And so those are the ones that I would kind of shuffle away. And then it was in 2019, Wright published a paper in ABA that also criticized cultural competence. And then I was like, whoa, wait a second. Maybe this isn't like a fringe idea about this. So now there's, I had that one community that was kind of teaching me about cultural competence, but now there's somebody within another community that I belong to that's also saying a little bit different things. And then I started attending trainings within behavior analysis because recently there's been a lot more trainings, and I heard more criticisms of cultural competence. And I was a bit confused because it wasn't the same term that I had kind of held on to, the same, definition. And so that's what kind of led me to kind of go back to, okay, let's look at Turvalon and Murray Garcia. They're the ones that introduced cultural humility. And let's kind of look at that debate across the decades and see kind of where we're at. There's so much papers, you really can't do it justice. But basically what I learned by kind of going back, because I wanted to get a better understanding of, where I should stand on this debate, is that it really seems to stem from the definition. There's so many different definitions. So Springer and Boyle say there's hundreds of definitions of cultural competence. And so it all depends upon which definition you're looking at. So some definitions, cultural competence is about acquiring a finite body of knowledge. And I would agree that that's not appropriate because that's going to foster stereotypes. If that's all it's about is just learning about groups, you're going to start to develop stereotypes. You're also never going to succeed, right? Because there's so many cultures, you can't learn that much knowledge to understand what to do. There's other definitions that talk about it as an endpoint. So there's like this culturally competent level that you reach and then you're done. And I agree, that's not appropriate. That's not a good definition. And then there's other critiques that it only focuses on race and ignores other cultural variables. And I agree that that's not an appropriate definition, because then we're going to ignore all these other important variables that impact our behavior. So it really kind of stemmed down to that definition. And the definition that Corina and I kind of latched onto was the one that is by Sue and colleagues. And they have a very comprehensive definition of cultural competence. It's a lifelong endeavor. It embodies cultural humility, and through the awareness domain, you have to learn about your own culture, learn about your own biases, try to interrupt them. You have to be able to assess your level of competence working with other people. You also have to learn knowledge about other groups, because how are you going to know that you're different if you don't know what other people are, right? So you have to be able to tack those differences. And then you also have to learn skills. So how do you adapt treatments to accommodate cultural variables? How do you adapt assessments to accommodate this? And so it was just kind of all-encompassing definition that we kind of latched onto throughout our project together. But then went through the review process, we were kind of also presented with a really important message from, the reviewers. And then also we had a great associate editor, Dr. Tyra Sellers, who really helped kind of with these papers too, and just commenting about how terminology can mean different things to different people. And if we're getting a lot of pushback in our field, we also have to recognize the privilege that we have to be able to publish on certain terminology. And that really struck with me too. And that's kind of made me go back and think, well, yeah, I've been kind of having this issue with confirmation bias, and now I'm kind of stuck on this definition. I need to be a little bit more flexible too, and really listen to what other people are saying. And so we adapted the domains outlined by Sue and colleagues, the cultural competence, the awareness, knowledge, and skills, and really kind of are discussing it as how to be more culturally responsive in practice. And that's a term that the BACB ethics code has adopted, cultural responsiveness. And, it's not our goal to hold the field back and debate terminology. We did this project because, one, we wanted to learn, and we also wanted to help push the field forward. We don't want to be just holding people back, kind of debating about that term. If it's a difficult term, then we can talk about it in another way. And I think that, competence does have a lot of verbal behavior associated with it. We think competency, you're going to reach this level. So we see how people are criticizing that terminology. And that's where we kind of came up with the cultural responsiveness title. But when we first submitted it, it was cultural competence. And so it was through that review process that was really important too, that helped us even shape it even more, and hopefully be a little bit more consumable to readers.
I had a question. I'm going to jump in here real quick, if you don't mind, Jeff. But a couple thoughts occurred to me as I was reading your paper. I guess the first thing is that this happens to me all the time, but it was particularly noticeable when I read both these papers. I got so distracted trying to read it because all these references would come up, and I would run down the references, because it's like, well, that's interesting. And so I ended up going down a bunch of different rabbit holes. My point being is it looked like you guys really did some nice work in terms of delving into literatures that were different than, what we're used to as behavior analysts, behavior scientists, et cetera. You mentioned Sue a number of times already, and that he was cited many, many times, I think, in both papers. So can you talk to are there lessons that you learned more generally about, what it's like to, kind of dip your toe into a different waters, trying to make heads or tails in a literature that they're not particularly trained in or familiar with, to the extent that may or may not have been the case. But can you just talk about your experience, and if there are other people such as Sue that you think listeners would benefit from checking out? Feel free to mention some of those sources that you found particularly informative.
That is our world, Matt. You experienced it, yes, going down rabbit holes and like, oh, this is interesting. Look at this thing I found. And that's what we always do, I guess. And I mean, there's a basic repertoire that we all have of being able to digest literature. And I think it's just applying that same skill set to whatever area you are interested in. To me, it doesn't feel unnatural to go outside of behavior analysis. When I was in grad school, we would often do this. We would read in our lab meetings, we would read things very far outside the field of behavior analysis, and they were very informative for linking things back into our research. So to me, it comes very naturally to look for things, even if people are talking in very non-behavioral terms. If it was relevant to the work I was doing, I was reading it. Daryl Sue is definitely an easy one. For me, another one is Melanie Domenech-Rodriguez. She is at Utah State University, where I did my grad work. And she is a clinical psychologist, and she, I think, is a really great example of adapting interventions to diverse families, Latino families in particular. So she has many, many great examples of cultural responsive practices and how to adapt evidence-based practices in a culturally sensitive way. So I think that's one example that a lot of people in our field might find quite relevant. But then if you're thinking of just kind of learning about these sort of things more generally, I always recommend a book by Janet Helms, and Lauren talking about kind of thinking of herself as lacking culture. I recommend this book to students when they say to me, like, I don't have a culture. And I said, okay, just read this book. It's really short, and it has activities in it, and it walks you through why you do have a culture, and the fact that you're saying that you don't is actually highlighting the privilege of your culture. And I'm glad we're having this talk. So there are a lot of people, and I think that it can be overwhelming. And I think that's another reason we wanted to do this, because it's so overwhelming. Like Lauren said, you could spend 5 years figuring out the whole issue with one term. And that's kind of disheartening, because then you walk out with, okay, well, what do I do with this? How do I change my practice? How do I change the way I teach students? And the idea for us was, okay, how can we boil this down to essentials, link it to the work that exists within our field, work that people are already doing, even if they're not calling it that, and then make it so that if people are interested in like rabbit holes, they can go down them and find things to read that are related to the work they're already doing.
That's helpful. So we've got Sue, we've got Janet Helms. I think that's Erase is a nice thing to have, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. I remember reading that one for a course many, many moons ago, but I think there's an updated version. And then what was that other one? You said it real quickly, and I didn't get a chance to write it.
Domenech-Rodriguez. I can write it out because it's long.
All right. Yeah. We'll make sure. I'm going to, for people listening, I've got a full notebook page already, and I'm going to try to, so we'll have some comprehensive show notes again. So we'll have that there. So thank you for walking us through that.
And there is that nice, the Counseling the Culturally Diverse by Sue and colleagues. They just came out with a new edition just like a month ago. And that one's a great resource too, because it's a textbook, but it combines a lot of research into chapters, really consumable chapters. And if you get the electronic copy, it even has video links. You can watch little videos. It has interactive chapters as well. So that's a good one.
Thank you. Thank you. At the risk of getting us a little bit off track, but I think it is related. You guys did bring it up in the paper. I think in the second one, you mentioned this concept of Western science as a culture itself, and I found that really interesting. And I was just wondering if you could spend a few minutes talking about that. What did you learn about that? What does it say about us as a kind of scientist practitioners? Yeah, I'll just leave it there, and if you can fill in those blanks, that would be great.
Yeah, we talked about, I think it might, I'm not sure if I think it might be the first paper, how depending upon the culture we come from, it can impact our view of Western science. So some people may, kind of cling on to Western science, and whereas other cultures, that's not really in something that they agree with, or, they might even oppose it. And so if you're working with individuals from cultures where Western science isn't valued, then they may offer, or they may suggest that they want to try treatments that are not empirically validated, or they might want to try more of those fringe treatments. And so I think as behavior analysts, especially those who are kind of in the dominant culture in the US, born and raised, white, and it's hard it can be hard sometimes to think, well, why would you want to do something like that. There's no evidence for it. There's actually evidence against it. And so it makes it hard for us to see their perspective. And I think that's kind of part of the whole perspective taking, realizing that not everybody values Western science. And so if you don't value it, then, and you value other more traditional methods, then you can kind of see why they might want to try some other method to see if it's effective. And in the second paper, we actually do talk about how, practitioners can potentially even collaborate with caregivers if they are suggesting these treatments that are not empirically validated, or they might have evidence against them, and that's using experimental design. And so Lerman and colleagues, they provide an example of that in behavior analysis and practice, where they evaluate the effects of the hyperbaric oxygen treatment with the family. So the families were already signed up for it. Lerman and colleagues did not bring the oxygen treatment there and do that, but the families already wanted to do it. And so they use the technology of single subject design to evaluate the effectiveness. But what we don't know is how well that's going, using that single subject design and showing that it's not effective. We don't really know if it's going to change people's minds, and I know, like when I was at Kennedy Krieger, we had a family that really wanted the gluten-free diet. And so the child was on the gluten-free diet. We did a functional analysis on the gluten-free diet and then a functional analysis without it, again, with consent from the family. And the results were the same. The behavior levels were the same, kind of suggesting that there wasn't an impact on that, but it wasn't enough for the family. They still wanted to kind of continue with that. So I'm not really sure if, we would need to get more data. That's like one of those areas where we need to get more data is what's the, can we shift people into more empirically validated treatments? That is a value that we have as behavior analysts. So,
it makes me think, appealing to data is not the answer for many of these families. And do we need another set of persuasive tools in our repertoires as we try to make socially relevant changes and more generally help people? So that's really helpful. Thank you for going into that.
This reminds me of, there's some recent work by Sean Gilroy looking at the acceptance of evidence-based practices and kind of like where the information comes from, basically. So one could imagine that in cultures that value the opinions of extended family, if the grandmother says, give it a shot, then that family is more likely to do it. So then this kind of speaks to the need to collaborate, in a culturally sensitive manner, right? So for some families, if you ask me, what does your mom think? I'll be like, I don't know, but for some people, I've been in meetings with families that I was expecting the one parent, maybe both, and they've shown up with all the grandparents, and it's been this like massive, meeting. So for that type of intervention, then you need to think, okay, well, then I need to get 8 people on board as opposed to one person on board. So it's kind of tailoring the way you conduct your work in a manner that aligns with the specific individuals, and not assuming that because you have a pretty graph, then everybody's going to be like, oh, that's amazing. That's amazing to us because of our training. But for a lot of people, those are not the values that are dominant.
One of the aspects I really appreciated about this was you guys discussed the values of the culture of behavior analysis and areas in which the goals of being culturally responsive mapped on very well to the values of behavior analysis, and areas where the field seems to inherently be doing well. Would you take a little bit to kind of describe some of the things that you see that the field's doing, or the values of the field that tend to lead well into being culturally responsive?
Yeah, so in figure, I think it's figure 1, the second paper, that we kind of summarize some of those key takeaways, because I think, when we're, as I mentioned before, trying to figure out how do we embed this culturally responsive practices throughout coursework, that's what kind of got us trying to figure out the best method. And I think if we start with the idea that, everything's connected, we just then have to connect it. And with respect to cultural responsiveness, it's all about collaboration. It's about listening to what the client is telling you. It's about incorporating their feedback. and asking open-ended questions, collecting demographics, and using that to help you better understand where they're coming from. And so if we kind of take that and map it on to behavior analysis, there are a lot of similar values. We value collaborating with people, right? We got social validity that Wolf introduced, the way we got our heart. But the problem is we still don't have that big of a heart, because as Ferguson and colleagues has shown us in 2019, that there's only 12% of JABA studies were publishing social validity data. And so even though we have this technology like social validity, we kind of need to incorporate it more into research and practice. Same with programming for generalization. So that's a way that we can learn from the environment that the person's living in, and we can program the treatment to have similar common features. But yet, how much are we actually doing that? That's kind of unknown. I saw a recent review that was showing that there wasn't that much published research on the best ways to program for generalization. So I think that even though we have very similar values with respect to learning from the individual, social validity, making sure that it's that treatment goals are acceptable, that treatment procedures are acceptable, I think we need to find a better way to incorporate that into practice. And I do think one of the biggest problems that we have, one of the potential issues that might be stopping us, is that self-assessment piece. Because I think that a lot of times we think it's socially acceptable. So we think, okay, this is an important goal because it's important to me. But we're not actually saying that, but that's kind of what's happening, right? Because we're not collecting the social validity data. We're not asking the person. But social validity isn't about, is it acceptable to me, the practitioner? Is it acceptable to the client? And so we need to start asking them more. And so I think that the more self-assessment you can do, the better you can realize your own culture, the impact of your culture on your behavior, the impact of your culture on your interactions, on pretty much every step of service delivery. Then I think we can start incorporating this more into behavior analysis. And, that's why we have those two papers. I mean, self-assessment is not just a throwaway thing. It's a really important piece that you can't achieve culturally responsive practice if you don't do that piece. You really have to start there. And then you can start maybe envisioning some of these things that we already know: programming, comment, stimuli, social validity, listening to our clients, asking those open-ended questions. I think that we might see that kind of happen more or flourish more if we kind of start with ourselves a bit, especially since, the demographics of our field is predominantly white U.S. citizens. So it's predominantly people in the dominant culture who typically have from what research has said, Sue has suggested this, that we have a hard time seeing our own culture and what that impact is on the people we interact with.
What role do the journals have, both JABA and beyond, in terms of this improving that metric that is not super impressive that you just cited a few minutes ago in terms of the percent of papers with social validity? Are there papers where we could say, okay, well, maybe we don't need if it's like a quick replication or a case study or something like that, whereas a very large one of the main research articles with maybe multiple experiments, on something that's novel, would that be more likely? Would that be more? I guess what I'm trying to explore, what are some guidelines that perhaps reviewers can give to authors, certainly, or maybe, I don't know if this is a policy thing or anything like that. But I'm just trying to think of what are some things that can be institutionalized to help move that needle forward in terms of having more social validity. At the same time, realizing that when I first started subscribing to JABA in the 90s, it was probably about a 3/8 of an inch, it's about a half an inch thick, and now it's the size of a textbook when it comes every quarter. So there's also perhaps considerations in terms of page space and things along those lines. So can you guys talk about, and Jeff, I'm interested to get your thoughts certainly on this as well.
Sure. And I'll do my best. And like anything, I'm going to give an overly long academic-y type of answer to this. But I'll say that there's a lot of different types of studies that get published in JABA. Some of them are more basic process oriented, where some of them are going to be much more, clinically focused interventions. And simply there are some questions where we're trying to assess social validity, maybe not as meaningful at that point in time, relevant to kind of like the stuff that's going end user, in the hands of being administered to families, in which assessing social validity would be more important at those stages. I don't know that it's enough to simply say like studies need to start reporting social validity, because the manner in which that's interpreted means a lot of different things. And there are really good, high quality ways of assessing social validity. And there are some really low effort, check the box ways. And I'll probably offend some people listening to this, and you can send me mean emails if you want to. But there's a difference between, for example, some of the things Lauren described of giving kids the opportunity who might be nonverbal to actively be able to communicate their preferences using things like concurrent change assessments of I prefer this treatment to no treatment, or I prefer this treatment option to this treatment option, or how well are parents implementing interventions once we're done, versus having a parent fill out a 7-point Likert scale and saying, seemed okay to me. I know for at least a few years, there was a lot more active discussion going on about not just that we should be collecting social validity data, but how should we be collecting social validity data in ways that are meaningful. And that is you as a consumer of research, you as a person who's going to be selecting whether or not to implement this intervention is giving you good, useful data. So the figures, I think you said 12%, Lauren, sounds really bad. And I have zero doubt it probably can and should be better. But kind of understanding the base rates along that as well is almost going through on like a study by study basis of like, where would social validity have been important with this? And then, in the manner, and if those 12% that were conducted, how many of those were, rating scales that maybe there was a more direct means of assessing those things. I know one of my colleagues in graduate school had planned and had started a really substantive review of social validity practices, and life happened and got caught up. And I think it's been, 15 years and there's a lot to catch up on. I'm not calling anybody out publicly, but if she's listening, she knows. We tease her about it a lot.
All right, I'll jump in. So you talked, Matt, about not social validity, but also you talked about demographic variables that Lauren had brought up before. And I think that's one thing, kind of back to Jeff's question of what we're doing regularly. I think that's one thing that we're starting to see more, the reporting of demographic variables of participants of studies. Nicole Gravina and her students recently published a paper in JOBM talking about the importance of this and kind of highlighting the relevance of this for the type of work that we do. And I think that one of the issues we have in that area is that we don't have a systematic approach for what demographic variables to report, which ones are relevant. But then it makes it hard for us to evaluate findings across studies. So if each study has 3 to 6 participants, and I know nothing about them other than they're an 8-year-old boy with autism, then that really doesn't tell me much about what I need to know, whether this is, as a practitioner, this will work for my client, or as a researcher, whether this, how to further explore this. But if you start to get a better idea of what sort of skill set this individual has, what challenges they have, linguistic needs, are they native English speakers, like all these things. And I think that by more people reporting demographic variables, that's one way to do it. I have heard that there are journals that have some requirements in terms of the reporting of demographic variables. I think that we would be getting ahead of ourselves in behavior analysis doing such a thing, because we don't really know, what do we need to know? Is age enough? I don't know. Do we need to know whether it's a boy or girl, or does it not matter? What if the child can't report their sex? Like all these things, like what do we label things? And I think that it can get tricky, but I think that starting to explore some of this can be useful, because like I've seen times when students grab a JABA paper and they say, I'm going to do this with my client. And then it's like, well, that's not going to work for your client, because your client doesn't have prerequisite skills, but they may not be able to detect that because they don't have the experience to know that particular prerequisite skills are required, for instance. But maybe if the paper explicitly listed particular skills that the child had, or, provided a bit more information and context, it could be useful for people to extrapolate to their practice. So that's one area that I think we're doing better, but we're kind of walking our way toward better. So,
well, I just wanted to say that I do think that rating scales and just interviewing a caregiver can be really important and information to get. The objective method of the concurrent chains arrangement, where you select something and then you experience it. That's wonderful. And that is extremely objective way to get preference. But it's really not practical. I think about the school system. I work in public schools. I see parents very, very limited. And so even having them kind of choose treatments, I have to find novel ways of incorporating choice into the behavior plans that I develop. And I think that, having a discussion with somebody or giving them an interview and having them rate whether or not they think something's important, it does provide us with some information. And I think about, when I go to the doctor and my doctor tells me about the options, I don't necessarily experience them all. I don't experience a little surgery or experience a little medication and then experience, just waiting it out. They kind of go through the risks and benefits, what they suggest, like, I really think you should do this, but you could do this or this. No, not all doctors like this. I particularly have a doctor that I like because, she does this. And I think so. I think that those discussion methods, they can be valid. They're used in other fields. And I think we can kind of do more of that to help build that rapport building too. It makes the person feel as though they're a part of that decision-making process, rather than you just giving them a behavior plan and saying, this is what I think you should do. Now, please sign it or tell me if you have any problems with it. It makes it more of a collaborative process. Again, not as objective as the current chains arrangement, but I do think we have to be a little bit more creative if we want to have more culturally responsive practices in different settings.
Recognize the challenge of speaking quickly without having time to necessarily compose all my thoughts. And Lauren, thank you so much for being more on the spot thoughtful than I was in that moment. There are definitely spots where, that's exactly what Wolf wrote about in the late 1970s, was the value of using indirect assessments where getting more direct measures would be impractical. I think my responding was more to perhaps not necessarily leaning on those exclusively as a default, that there are some other ways in certain circumstances that would be more appropriate for collecting social validity data. And going through a lot of Mount Wolf's early work really highlighted a lot of I actually at one point in my life was planning on writing a social validity paper of like, here's how we can do it more objectively. And I was trying to go through the literature, finding like non-examples. And I kept reading all of Mount Wolf stuff from the 70s going, darn it, everything I want to recommend, he actually already did. So this paper's not going anywhere. But of trying to train like job, filling out job applications or going on job interviews, and then having potential employers actually be the ones rating them. So not, asking parents how satisfied were you with the training, but being much more focused on the outcomes of the skill. Obviously, parent satisfaction is incredibly important as well. But in that regard, trying to validate the outcomes of it being an example. So allow me to practice a bit of my own cultural humility and say you were right on that one entirely. I also wanted to hop in, Corina, for what you were just talking about, because it was one of the things that hit me while I was reading your paper and is immediately changing my own behavior. It had to do with the reporting of native language speakers, of reading and hear suggestions of how we could, be more culturally representative, and of reporting everybody's language. And my initial thought was, well, almost everybody I work with speaks English. Why wouldn't I just report if it was different? And immediately went, it's exactly what you were talking about, is that I was assuming the dominant culture was the default. And it was just an experience of me catching myself doing it, which is exactly what we want to try and not do. So I just wanted, again, Chris Farley show today. Remember when you said that? That was great.
But I think, Jeff, you're highlighting some really awesome, like why these discussions are so needed, right? Like these things come, you're able to kind of self-reflect in the moment when you're having these conversations. So I think, we need to have more of these conversations. So I think that that's wonderful. So thank you for demonstrating that, like in the podcast.
I'm grateful for every opportunity to have these. I can have to have these conversations with you and everybody else. I've never walked away from, what can be a difficult or at times uncomfortable conversation. There's always so much growth. I've always experienced so much growth from going into an area that I'm not initially comfortable. One of the challenges I know from trying to write review papers, particularly review papers for Java, is finding your audience for that paper, is finding the balance of speaking to researchers versus speaking to clinicians. And it's usually you got to pick one. But I thought with these papers, you guys did a really nice job of kind of laying out recommendations for clinicians of here's some steps you can take right now. And then kind of following that up with, for researchers, here's some, find out if we're right, basically, is we've got some recommendations. So I guess starting off with clinicians, if you kind of had to do your top 5 list of kind of like what are the things you could change and start doing tomorrow to engage in more culturally responsive practice, where would you suggest for those who are looking to take those first steps?
I think self-assessment is number one. I think to your point, Jeff, I think there was something we kept in mind for sure of how do we speak to both? And I think because we are both, we work with clients, we are researchers, we could see the value of both things. I think that a lot of people, like I said earlier, they don't want to read all this stuff and be like, okay, great, this is all fascinating, but what do I do with it? And how do I put it into practice tomorrow? So we wanted to be able to have people turn it into practice. And I think that, as Lauren has highlighted, the importance of self-assessment is huge, because being able to do what you just did of, kind of stopping and saying like, oh yeah, that I can see why that wasn't necessarily spot on, or why it could be different depending on different circumstances. So that ability to continue to grow and show humility in our practice, mentorship, supervision. And another one is being able to work collaboratively with humility with all the stakeholders that are relevant. I think those two are probably the most important ones, because everything kind of falls from that. I can see my limitations. I can see where my biases are. I can see where I need to watch out for myself, because under these particular stimulus conditions, I tend to have knee-jerk reactions that might not be great. And then I also listen. By working collaboratively, I'm listening. I'm not walking into meetings with a final draft of a plan of care. I'm walking in with a working document that we're going to shape together. So it's a very different approach. And I think if you walk in with an open laptop and say like, these are the notes I have, let's work on it together, versus here's the printed document, can you please sign the bottom? Very different approach. To me, those are the top two.
I agree with Corina. The self-assessment, that really has to start, because I don't know how you could do all of the others if you don't see the impact. Again, if you don't understand the impact of your culture on your behavior, and then you're the one behaving with the client, you're the one doing the rapport building, you're the one interacting, communicating, you're the one helping select the goals, writing up the assessment, treatment procedures, then how are you going to be able to do it? So I completely agree that self-assessment is kind of that critical first piece. And social validity, right? It encompasses all of that: collaboration, listening to the client, asking for feedback. So is this acceptable? Is this something that you want, help with? So that really, really embodies the whole culturally responsive practices. Also, again, programming for generalization, that's like a nice little aside, right? Because then we're forcing ourselves to look at the lived environment and incorporate that. The collaborating with the client by interviewing them, again, that helps us adapt the assessments, adapt the treatment based on that collaboration. So I feel like there's a couple components that if you can hit that collaboration piece by getting feedback from other people, you're really going to start that culturally responsive practice. But you can't really do much of that if you don't see how your culture is impacting what you're doing. And I know that's probably not what people want to hear, because self-assessment is so not objective, and we don't have a lot of good data on it. And what's the best way? And does it lead to best outcomes? We don't know. So I do get that for, behavior analysts, I feel like that's the area that we're kind of a little more we have a difficult time consuming that because of the fact that we don't have that evidence. But there is evidence in other fields that if you do take time to self-reflect, you will learn more about your background. So we at least know that. And then we need research on, how does that lead to best or better outcomes, more collaboration with people. That would be important to look at.
I'll just say, as a program, we did go through a self-assessment activity of our faculty and our students together of taking about, we did the self-assessment 1 week and then came back together as a group to kind of discuss our findings, and those share who are welcome to. And I just want to say it was a wonderful process. It sounds uncomfortable on the front end for anybody who's thinking about, maybe I should give this a shot. I do highly recommend it. It was an informative process. So beyond the recommendations for the clinicians as your top takeaways, in some of the areas of research that you laid out, and what, for the listeners who are maybe trying to come up with their thesis, their dissertation topic ideas, what were some of the really big ones that, drop everything, this is the first one that we should be looking at type of research ideas?
It's hard to pick one. That's why we created tables. We couldn't pick one. There are a lot of things. I mean, to me, I'm really excited about what's happening right now. Just the papers that are coming out. I can't keep up with the things I want to read. So that's always exciting and frustrating at the same time. I think determining where we are as a field. So there was a recent paper, for instance, Devin 2022, looking at racial school discipline disparities for behavior analysts. So, where are we in terms of school discipline? So just kind of where is the field in different areas in terms of diversity, or can we use our tools to explore issues of diversity? Michael Machado and Ashley Lugo published a paper in Behavior Analysis and Practice. And it was, how do we use our methodologies to evaluate efficacious strategies on policing and reducing discriminatory practices on policing, for instance. So there are just there's a paper that everybody should read for sure. It's in JABA, very recent JABA. It was by Fernanda Oda and Sarah Lachago, and they were looking at gender bias in verbal behavior. So basically what they found is that the perceived gender can exert stimulus control over the speaker's behavior. So this is a really good example of how can we use our behavioral methodology to evaluate the impact of social cultural variables on behavior and on our own bias. So if a man tells me, a woman tells me, I might behave differently. So there are a lot of examples in the literature right now of really cool things that are happening. And I think it's just kind of more systematically continuing to explore culture in the context of behavior and not shying away from it. So it is a variable, and take it into account. Either use our tools to study it and to study how it behaves, the impact it has, or to kind of learn more about what we're already doing. So there are really a lot of examples. And like I said, I can't keep up. We recently published a paper, so my students and I did a study looking at instructive feedback using Spanish. So we were trying to have more socially meaningful impact in the life of the individuals we were working with. So we were working in a clinic where all the services were delivered in English, but their first language was Spanish. So we were doing lots of things, but it wasn't really going to be socially meaningful in their environment because that was not the language that was predominant in their lived environment. So how can we use what we know about behavior, the tools we already have, and how can we organize the interventions in a way that are going to lead to the most meaningful outcomes for the individual? So great if they have listener skills at the end, but wouldn't it be great if the listener skills were useful in the clinic environment and in the home environment, not just because of generalization across context, but because now this child, which we found actually happened, could understand English and Spanish. So just thinking about a little bit of expanding to include linguistic variables and cultural variables. Like I said, lots of really cool things that are already happening. So if I had to pick one, I wouldn't have a number one. But if there are passionate people that want to work on this, I'm happy to work with them. So if anybody wants to be my student and work on this, they can pick number one and I'll just hang out with them.
I agree with Corina. There's a lot of great research coming out now. And one area that we kind of just briefly touch on it, and I think it's in paper too, is looking at how do we, this would be really, really challenging study. How do we shift people who don't think this is important into thinking that this is important, into seeing how important this is, right? So I was reading a paper recently. It's Humble Behaviorism Redux by Kirby and colleagues, just came out a couple months ago. And they mention some troubling things that they've seen in the field. And they mentioned a presentation that they saw at a conference where the person, the speaker had said that our field is inherently unbiased. And so, I'm sure that this person, the speaker, isn't the only one to think like this, though. And so how do we start shifting people into thinking more about how we all have biases, that they all are, because we're all cultural beings, we're all shaped by our community. Being biased, I think, is inherent in being a social organism. And so how can we shift people into seeing the importance of cultural responsive practice, and that it is important? And that's like a really challenging research question. But so if you want to drop everything, if you could do that, that would be great. I think also going back to the social validity thing that we were talking about earlier, finding more ways to incorporate that into practice, leaving academia, going back to practice. I've noticed, I thought that the research practice gap was going to be better. It's actually much worse than I thought. And I think academia kind of jades you a bit into thinking that, behavior analysis, it can do so much. It can be used to really change the world, which it can, but we have so far to go in practice. Talking about, I work in public schools. And so talking about how to get that research and make it work in other environments, we have a long ways to go. So I think if researchers were to make connections, kind of like symbiotic relationships with practitioners to really help bridge that research practice gap in this area, I think would be really, really helpful too.
I guess the one practice related thing, and I know we've spent quite a bit of time here. Maybe, I don't know if this is the last segment we'll land on or not. Maybe we'll have some time for some concluding thoughts, but I had to take the opportunity to kind of ask a question. You guys did spend a bit of time talking about cultural responsiveness as it relates to assessment, and particularly functional assessment. Can you walk us through your point of view on that? And there's some, with respect to also some of the references between, So I'll just maybe put my framing or bias, I suppose, front and center here. So it looked like there was some language that was more biased towards, kind of more of a synthesized contingency versus an isolated one. So I don't know if that was correct or not, but I guess more generally, I'd like you to kind of maybe step the listener through why you want to, what your point is, or what your, the purpose was with regard to talking about it in that respect.
I'm going to jump in. And so it's funny when I often tell my students to listen to your podcast and listen to the Hanley, Fisher, sides of FAs, and just to kind of get it from the experts, get it directly from them, what they're talking about, in addition to reading their work. And I think, again, it speaks to the culture, right? So if you worked with Greg Hanley, you think one way. If you work with Wayne Fisher, you think a particular way, regardless of the fact that both things are published in JABA and everybody can freely consume them. So it speaks to that thing that Jeff was talking about earlier of the microculture within behavior analysis, of who did we train with, who was our lab mate, the lab lore that gets passed on. And that's the culture that forms us into the behavior analysts we are today and the way we think things should be done. And I think that before jumping into, I'll let Lauren tackle the core of the question. Actually, she's probably better suited for it, but I just wanted to comment that to me, it's regardless of what you call it, many of us will not do an FA that looks exactly like what Brian and Watt have published, right? So I think we can agree that we don't do exactly that. We don't take and replicate it all the time. But what we don't know is how practitioners are including and considering variables when they're modifying the FA conditions for their clients. What are the modifications? Are they considering aspects of the individual culture and their context and their learning history, how are they doing this? So there's no systematic research that allows us to arrive at evidence-based best practices for what are the guidelines of how to incorporate the individual's cultural variables. So you could do particular things. So like we cite Dennison et al. 2019 for a cultural analysis, so practicing humility and collaboration for talking to the caregivers or whatever to figure out, okay, what type of attention, what type of whatever. But I think what we need more of are studies like the Rispoli et al. 2011 of including linguistic variables, or the Sami et al. 2019 of including different types of attention and demands. So just looking at systematically evaluating it. So I'm not going to get into the synthesized or not synthesized conversation. I'm more just taking a step back and saying, we all need to be doing it. It doesn't really matter if you belong to a camp, don't belong to any camp, you visit all the camps of FAs. It's more about, do we really know what aspects matter in terms of embedding relevant cultural variables that could be the difference between an undifferentiated FA and a non, and one that tells us something about the individual's behavior.
And I agree with Corina too. It's really about what's going to be important for the client. And, I have some biases. I trained with Greg. He was my PhD advisor. But I kind of look at myself more as like a free agent. I don't belong to teams. And I think that tries to help me be more objective. So I think once we get into the mindset of, PFA all the way, that's dangerous, right? Because then we're going to be subjective to more issues with respect to confirmation bias. We're going to kind of disregard things that aren't mapping on perfectly. So I think it's best to kind of step back and kind of take what is best for the client. And so in that discussion, in that second paper, we don't just talk about how the practical functional assessment, the synthesized analysis can be helpful for delivering culturally responsive practice. We also talk about how the standard FA can be adapted to meet the cultural needs. So it's kind of showing that balance. Like, we're not saying like you got to do it this way. We are saying though that you do have to interview. If you want to do culturally responsive practice, you do have to interview people. You have to learn about the lived environments of the clients, and you have to make adaptations of those conditions. Whether that's a synthesized contingency or not, that's going to depend upon the client. And one of the examples that we provided in the paper, the Sami et al. Paper, they were working with two clients and two children in Greece. And so they adapted the standard FA, and they had an escape from touch on the face condition, because that's like an affectionate thing, apparently in Greece, where the elders will touch the kids on the face affectionately. And they found that was actually the function of one of the kids' behavior. The problem behavior was escape from that affectionate touch. So I think that I know it's very contentious for whatever reason. And I think it's, we subscribe to these thoughts and then we think that that's the only way. But I think that we need to take a moment and kind of step back. And if we're following kind of the tenets of culturally responsive services, we interview the client, we find out what's happening before the problem behavior, what's happening after, and we try to replicate that so that we can actually get at the true nature. I mean, even, Skinner, you can go back to Science and Human Behavior, and he talks about how, one of the biggest neglects is to not look at how synthesizing variables, right? And so, I mean, he talked about it back in 1958 or something. So I think that it's not that we do it one way or the other. It's just we have to figure out what makes sense for the client in front of us and make adaptations. And, Corina mentioned too, that a lot of people are already doing this. In Jessel 2020, they showed that a lot of people are. 49% of the people are adapting FAs, but 51% of the studies they looked at weren't. They were running it kind of with these same kind of standard conditions, which is a little bit dangerous with respect to if we want to make it culturally responsive. We have to be able to kind of adapt. So I don't know. I hope that kind of answers the question, but I think that it's not necessarily PFA or standard. It's what's going to be best for the client. If you want to do it culturally responsive, make sure you're interviewing, you're learning about the lived environment, and then kind of replicating that to understand the function of the behavior.
And I'll, of course, have a thing or two to say, but I'll just, my own biases as well. I was also trained by Greg Hanley. He was my PhD advisor. That I think I've always hated the notion or the term of a standardized functional analysis. I don't believe there is such a thing. Is that there was a framework that was laid out by Iwata in 1982, and it was never meant to be like, this is the box that you put everybody in. It was the idea of a test and control methodology, is that if you suspect something as a reinforcer, how should it respond? Well, if you arrange an appropriate EO and you deliver a reinforcer contingent upon that, the behavior should increase. And you've got a relevant control condition in which, if you provide free access that, you shouldn't see responding. And if it's a reinforcer, then that's how you test something as a reinforcer. That in terms of being culturally responsive, that process should be individualized to every kid that you work with. I conduct isolated contingency functional analyses as part of what I do, and every process starts out with an interview with caregivers and an open-ended interview. The first question I generally ask after what's your kid's name and their birth date and what's your address is, what do you hope I can help you with while you're here? So someone reading your paper was like, okay, good, I feel like I'm doing that. Is I always let parents set the goals by telling us, what is it that you want to work on? And when we get to the part where we're going to talk about problem behavior, it's, where does this seem to be a problem most often for you? When is this happening? What's going on in your environment? And we tailor our conditions to map onto the things that they're describing. That to me is a separate part of the process than whether you're isolating or synthesizing your contingencies. I will argue all day long that regardless of the analysis that you're conducting, having it informed by the relevant stakeholders is a critical piece of that. That the idea that we're going to deliver the same type of attention or present the same tasks or remove the same toys from everybody, and that's going to be a functional analysis is, it's just silly. That'll be my polite version of it.
Yeah, and I thank you for kind of sharing that opinion too, because I think that, I think we share very kind of similar opinions as, we need to start with that interview. But I think that you're kind of getting at too, the research to practice gap, right? So you've had really, wonderful training in behavior analysis. I still remember before I went on to a master's, I was working as a BC ABA. And I still remember my first FA, and it was my supervisor got out the AWADA, and we were going through it. And okay, how are we going to do this condition? And we were replicating it just like that. When I went to Kennedy Krieger, we were replicating the AWADA. I mean, again, this was, 10 years ago, so I'm not sure how things have changed, but we were replicating very similar conditions in the AWADA paper. So I agree that I don't think that maybe that wasn't his intention, but it's like that research practice gap. How do we make those studies come to life for practitioners so that they understand how to adapt that to their practice? And I think that's like a whole nother conversation, because I feel like that's where a lot of practitioners get stuck, is they go to the research and it's like, oh, it's telling me to do this and I have to do exactly this. And they don't really have those kind of skills to adapt unless they have, so I think that, but again, that's another discussion.
I think this is a conversation that's a whole nother podcast. And so there's probably a lot of restraint that was being applied here in that discussion. But I think it's important to talk about that, because that seems to be a pretty salient piece of something that is really relevant to practitioners, because a lot of us are just, trying to help individuals who have these repertoires of challenging behaviors. And how do we do that with a culturally responsive framework is certainly something important to talk about. I think we're getting close to our time limit here. I want to see if there are any final thoughts, final questions. Jeff, I don't know if you have any. I think you might have a question or two. You're shaking your head no. Okay, so what I suppose I'll leave it with Corina and Lauren. I suppose what I'd like to do then is if there are any final thoughts that you guys have to kind of take us out. Certainly, I'll also just reiterate. I've said this a couple of times already, but just in case folks missed it. We'll have extensive show notes for this episode. Certainly, I've got now more than 2 pages of references to run down. I would also recommend just getting the articles themselves, and the reference sections to those articles represent just an incredible amount of scholarship. So you guys are really to be commended on pulling all these various resources together synthesizing all these concepts and terms and things like that for the benefit of the field. So thank you very much.
Well, originally it was one extremely long paper that was more like a very short book. And then we turned it into a shorter paper, and then it became 2 papers. There are sections we left out of the original draft that, we're hoping to develop in the future. There is a lot to read and a lot to develop. And this paper has really been an evolution. So anything that isn't there, so anybody who's a BCBA can get free access to JABA papers on the BCB website. So these are freely available to anybody. Anything that isn't there, it's a result of our editing, rearranging, evolving, thinking about the issue. And as Lauren said before, Tara Sellers was wonderful to help us kind of, she made very thoughtful suggestions and comments, but as we wrote something, then we go back to it and we say like, oh, we don't think about this like this anymore, or there's a better way to think about this, or we found this other thing. And so it's really nice to see how the papers that are in print now are different than our original one. And I wonder sometimes, if in a few years I'll go back to read it and say, oh, I can't believe that's the one we went with, Hopefully it's not too bad. One thing that I guess we didn't talk about, but I think about a lot relative to this as it pertains to research, is work on community-based participatory research. We don't really talk about that much in our paper. Aubin Stamer, who was our BF Skinner invited speaker for the autism area, I invited her this year, and she gave a really wonderful talk. And she does really amazing work of partnering with community members and stakeholders in the research process. And I think that that's a really powerful tool for conducting research in a culturally responsive way. Within behavior analysis, Jamela Watson-Thompson does a lot of this work. So kind of for people that are, back to Jeff's question of research, so I kept thinking about it, that's another area too, and it's not so much the question to ask, but how do you ask questions of social significance in a way that is culturally responsive, and it is not to show up in a community and just say, I have a question, help me answer it. It's let's work together to identify questions that are relevant for you and how we can work together toward that.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And again, thanks to both of you for coming on and talking about your scholarship in this area.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.